Looking like another light showing this week.
Yeah, we're probably into the quiet time.
Yeah, I think so. All these register us as being here, but we'll see what we get done today or not.
Yeah, just the three people.
Say we give another 10 minutes, and unless either of you have something you want to talk about, we can go ahead and wrap it up at 10 after.
Nothing
Yep.
here.
So I I have a few things, but it's kind of unrelated to the working group specifically, but the like more general OCI. But like for this specific working group, I guess I am just volunteering to give some time because I have some time. So the idea is like I want to get more involved in the OCI stuff.
Happy to have help wherever we can get it.
So is the idea of the working group to like develop a spec for authentication?
It's currently a gap in the OCI spec that we feel like we need to close up. And so there is a spec from Docker back in the day where they defined how authentication was going to work. And I think the goal that we've got for ourselves, at least initially, is to define an OCI version of what authentication should look like. May look almost identical to Docker, may have some differences in there.
Sure.
And one of the things we're pushing for is to try to leverage existing HTTP specs as best we can. So try not to reinvent any wheels, while at the same time, we want to make sure that we are breaking as few existing implementations as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah, the a lot of these old like old password based authentication is uh is hard for a lot of people in like Red Hat to swallow. So, for example, the way we distribute it is we have a proxy for OIDC in front of the images. So people authenticate using OIDC and they turn it into a token, and that token is like like they still use username and password, but it's actually the password is a JWT token.
Yeah, that sounds like the bare authentication. That's part of the Docker spec. It's one of the two options.
Okay.
And so, yeah, OIDC is part of what we're considering. Um, and then, yeah, the straight basic authentication is the other option to put in there. Either of those would be non-breaking, I think, or minimally breaking. I don't think there are many people that wouldn't work with those scenarios.
Yeah.
The the reason I say trying to avoid breaking changes is that there are folks that'll come in and say, let's do machine authentication where we shift everything over to Spiffy Spire or something like that. And it's like, that would be great, but nobody's doing that yet. And so if we start to standardize on that, that won't work anywhere. So you got that sort of challenge. Got other people want to see MTLS, and MTLS is one of those things where you could probably layer that on top of whatever was being done. But I don't know if you want to specifically put that into the spec because that is very environment specific. So a few challenges along those lines. We're also not getting into how the client gets the password to initiate that OIDC or or the basic authentication workflow. So things like the Docker credential helpers where they have some tool you call and get your password from that. We're
Yeah.
not going into that at all. We're strictly going from where the client starts to talk to the registry and the authentication server and back.
Gotcha. Yeah, it seems like OIDC is the more universally supported method. I'm not too familiar with like using Spiffy. I don't know how that works.
Uh, I wouldn't even bother digging into that right now, just
Okay.
because it's it's going to be out of scope for what we're looking at right now.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah, but the reason I bring that up is just there are people that have grandiose visions of if they are reinventing authentication from first principles today and using all the new latest and greatest. And I try to slow them down and saying, well, we're not there. The place we're at right now is we've got a lot of existing users out there and we just want to put some stuff in writing so that as people implement this stuff, they're at least talking the same language and they can point to something and say, okay, the registry needs to fix something or the client needs to fix something. But we're not reinventing everything that's already been done. We're just getting it standardized as to what it looks like today, mostly.
Gotcha.
At least historically, what we've been doing in this group is we have gone through a handful of the existing implementations out there. So we've looked at Containerd, Moby, ORS, Reg Client, a few of the implementations that are doing some stuff around authentication that we had some experience with and could document. So we got those documented saying here are some existing client implementations of what they expect when they talk to the registry. I don't think we've spent the time to go through and saying here's what registries are expecting, but I think it's just kind of the inverse of whatever the clients are doing. And then from there, as time permitted, and this is one of those things where a lot of us just haven't had the time, we wanted to spend some effort going through some of the HTTP specs and looking at that. We also had a while back and buried down our notes, kind of looking at the different use cases we need to make sure we're covering. And so we were talking about that back November 14th, which probably needs to get pulled into the GitHub repo somewhere. The various different scenarios. And so, there are scenarios when a registry doesn't need to authenticate. Make sure we don't break that. There are scenarios where you have a client that's just pulling a single image. That's kind of the common scenario everybody knows, everybody supports. But then
Yeah.
you get into more complicated stuff where you have the cross-repository blob mount. You have requests that will follow a forward over to a CDN server somewhere.
Right.
And so you don't want to send your private credentials to a public server that doesn't need those credentials. So we started documenting a bunch of those different use cases, different scenarios where we thought there would be problems or things to be aware of. So we probably need to get some of that captured, written up a little better into our working group GitHub repo.
Sure. Yeah. For the CDN stuff, we just create a temporary signed URL, which kind of expires in 15 minutes, let's say. And I think that's what this general solution is, what everyone is doing.
I was about to say, I feel like that's a pretty common solution where the access is put into the URL itself. And
Yeah.
so the client isn't supposed to be doing anything fancy with it. They just follow the redirect.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what else you could do without like having an authentication piece on this CDN side. So for example, one of the CDNs we use is Cloudflare. They support having a sort of a Lambda on their edge. So you could have an implementation where that Lambda could act as an authenticator for requests. But again, like that's very implementation specific and it's only specific to a certain CDN providers. So I don't think there's like a very general solution that works on all CDNs. Like you couldn't do this for AWS, for example.
It gets out of my expertise, but I think a lot of what we're trying to do here is just to say at a fundamental level from the client side, don't send the password
Hmm.
that gets you into this private registry to a public CDN. Just simple stuff like that.
Gotcha.
Especially when you're doing like base 64 encoding or basic
Yeah.
authentication where you're just passing a straight password.
Yeah.
Little details like that are very useful. And hopefully the CDN isn't going to respond back that, hey, you need to log in. Or if they do, then we need to make sure that we define if it asks for a login,
Hmm.
don't give it the credentials.
Could we pass in the same auth token to the CDN?
I would want to get a better understanding for if CDNs need that before trying to put that into a spec.
So I'll tell you the problem with the signed URLs is they're not technically private. So anyone who can get access to that URL within that time frame can essentially download that blob, right?
Mhm.
So um, yes, it is time bound, and but it's like yeah, you kind of get into that. Um, if you have the URL you were able to access. But then again, like if you have access to the client's access token, it's the kind of the same thing. Yeah, yeah, it gets complicated.
I think a bunch of us want less complicated if we can get there, if possible.
Awesome. Okay. Well, actually, on a separate sort of note, I had messaged on the Slack board yesterday that so do you know about the Kubeflow project?
Go ahead and walk through where you're going with that.
So Kubeflow is an open source I guess, framework for running machine learning workloads on Kubernetes. So it takes care of like converting TensorFlow jobs, and it has like a framework for serving them and blah blah blah. You get the idea. But there is no set standard for storing anything. So they need storage for um, their models. They need storage for their training data. There's also some uh, metadata storage, and all of them have different storages right now. So they store their models and training data on S3. They store their metadata on like another metadata server. Um, they've invited. So I was talking to people here in Red Hat about um, using OCI for storing and serving their models because the registry is going to be everywhere where they're deploying Kubernetes. So why not just use that instead of like spinning up another thing? So um so yeah, I was just tomorrow I have like a quote unquote demo with the community. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas of like what would be good use cases. I've outlined a few in the chat.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the internals of the challenges from the machine learning group, and so I hesitate to get too much of an opinion. Um, but in general, OCI is a content addressable blob store with uh, a little bit of extra management add on top of that.
Mhm.
So if that's what they need, makes a lot of sense to me. The the questions I would start to throw out there is when we're starting to get into what the size of the blobs are uploading,
Yeah.
how frequently are pieces in there changing, and how do they change? Um, is what I'm thinking of is along the lines of if you just have a straight blob that's 3 gigs in size and you change 2 bytes in the middle of that, but you're not structuring in any way, you can pull those 2 bytes out. Now you have to re-upload 3 gigs.
Right.
So those are the kinds of questions I'll be looking at is, do they need something that is kind of at a file level storage, or do they need something more to block level storage because of the way they change things? And it's always possible you could convert block level storage into something that would work quasi in an OCI registry. You just make each block a separate blob and do something. But
Hmm.
that's kind of the way I'm thinking along those lines.
That's an interesting way to do it. I'm pretty sure it's all binary data. Their machine learning models are all binary. So it's going to be like a single layer images that they're going to upload
Yeah.
with whatever artifact type they want to put in.
And so the question is, how big is that layer going to be? And how frequently is that layer changing?
Yeah. Yeah. And they wouldn't really benefit from content sharing as well, like because there's no concept of like a inherited model, at least that as far as I know. So you
Mhm.
cannot have like a base model and then you can have like layers of different things added on top of it. So they're gonna kind of miss that.
Yeah. But if there's a way you can pull out content that is changing less
Mm,
and it's something that's frequently changing, if you can somehow shift that content that is changing infrequently into one blob and have the more frequently changing stuff in a different blob, then you
yeah.
start to get some advantages.
I
And
think
this is where I just don't have enough knowledge of internals of machine learning of what their scenario looks like in terms of the storage.
yeah, me neither. Um, Although I think the training data might benefit from this because they can have like a golden copy of their training data and then they can
Mhm.
add on top of it. And training data is just files.
Yep.
That's easier to deal with than binaries.
Hmm.
Cool. And yeah, there's no like I don't think there's anyone who's there's no standard there right now, which is interesting. Oh, another thing they were looking for is RBAC control. I don't think OCI really specifies how to do RBAC, but every registry does it in their own kind of way.
What do you mean by the RBAC side? Because
So
this
so
this is the Auth working group.
yes, that's true. So okay, so this could be maybe kind of related. RBAC in the sense of who can push and who can pull and who can view. Um, so right now, anyone who has access to the password is able to pull the image, right? Um, but so there's no RBAC on saying, hey, this user has access to this repos, is there? Like OCI doesn't control that. Like that's just implementation.
It is just implementation that gets to the layer just outside of where we're looking at, but not that far outside.
Yeah. Could OCI add like uh RBAC as a thing in the spec? Like this is what the permissions can be for a specific namespace or a repo, and these are the operations that can be done, and these are the roles.
So I think the direction we look at this from is that we want to make sure whatever we standardize as a spec allows every implementation to create the RBAC policies they want to create.
Hmm.
And so we want to make sure we don't design a spec where someone says, I've got this RBAC requirement, I just can't do it with whatever you gave me. The spec isn't flexible enough for that.
Okay.
So in those scenarios, we want to avoid breaking use cases in those terms. Where we get to in some of this stuff is acknowledging what the Docker spec had done, which was that they started putting a scope field in there as part of the authentication. The scope field says, here's the repository, and here's my access that I'm looking for within that repository.
Hmm.
And then we want to acknowledge that that's the way it was done in the past. It was also done client side, which is a little awkward for us. We want to try to push that more server side and have the server maintain what those scopes are.
Yeah.
Because if the server maintains it, what can happen is you can, as a client, try to connect to the server and say, I want to pull this specific tag, and they can give you some different kind of scope that would be finer grain.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is basically the auth endpoint where you send in the scope and they give, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you can, we would like to make it possible that someone could be finer grain if they wanted to. There's also the consideration that OCI has the extensions design where instead of going to a repo, there's a underscore syntax in there where anything that has a underscore in the beginning of the path name is kind of an extension that might be some kind of user-defined, registry-defined feature they added to their registry. And they might want to have special authentication to get into their special extensions to do things. And so how can we make sure that we keep the spec flexible enough that they can leverage this for whatever their use cases might be in the future?
Understood. Cool. Yeah, I think this would be a good addition for sure. Especially if you're proposing this to be like backwards compatible. That's an easier implementation to swallow for people.
Yeah, I think the direction I suspect that we're looking at is to take stuff that was client side, move it to server side, but then make the recommendation the server gives the response to trigger the client to do the exact same processing that clients that were doing it themselves would have done the same processing. And so you get that backward forward compatibility. But then as clients shift over to allowing the server to control some of these fields, you
Gotcha.
get more power in the future. You get functionality you couldn't do before when the clients were manually generating some of these fields.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can take a look at the different ways people do RBAC, make a document or something.
Yeah. We've got the GitHub repo. So if you want to put some documentation there, feel free to submit a PR and we will take a look at it. Like I say, I probably need to do the same for some of the stuff we've been talking about in the working group.
Yeah. Cool.
Anything else you don't want to chat about?
Uh,
You've got the floor here.
this is nice, quiet meeting. No, not a lot of noise. No, but this has been great. Thank you.
I would say this meeting is drama free because all the air is in the other room in the other meeting right now is we're trying to get this release pushed out the door. And I think this working group was probably rushed a little bit prematurely, but we're still making a little bit of progress as we find the time around here.
Nice. Yeah, I ad hocly attend those meetings and they kind of end up in a rambling match.
Yeah. It has been a painful process getting to the point that it's at, and I don't know what it's going to look like when we finally get to the eventual conclusion of this.
Anyway, well, I don't have anything else. Thank you for listening to me and thanks for your time.
Yeah, you bet. So I think next week we'll have one last meeting before the holidays kick in, and I'm guessing that once the holidays do kick in, that we'll have even less attendance. So it might be
I'm out
one.
next week.
Yeah. I
And
suspect next meeting will probably be very thin on the attendance, and then we'll go ahead and cancel the next two after that.
yeah, sounds good.
So, Nathan, anything from you before we go ahead and close this up?
Nope, nothing for me.
All right. Well, until then, have a great rest of the week.
Thank you and happy holidays.
Yeah, you
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Cheers.